It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and the park was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter. Children ran across the open field, their shouts and squeals echoing through the trees, while parents sat on benches, watching with fond smiles. Claudia, a 12-year-old girl with a calm demeanor and a kind smile, sat quietly on a bench near the playground, her nose buried in a well-worn book. She came to the park often, finding solace in its lively atmosphere and the escape her books provided. Though she was usually alone, she never felt lonely. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in stories while keeping an eye on the world around her. Claudia was observant. She noticed everything: the way the leaves shimmered in the breeze, the way the light danced on the pond, and the people who frequented the park. She often watched the other children play, her heart warming at their carefree joy. Sometimes she joined their games, offering a helping hand when someone fell or a comforting word when tempers flared. She was always ready to step in, her gentle nature making her a friend to anyone who needed one. Today, as she turned the pages of her book, a sudden commotion drew her attention. She looked up to see a little boy, probably no more than 6, chasing a ball that had bounced out of his grasp. He was laughing, his small legs pumping as he ran after it, oblivious to the pond ahead. His parents, engrossed in conversation on a nearby bench, hadn't noticed him yet. Claudia's heart skipped a beat as she saw the ball roll towards the water. The boy was close behind, his focus solely on the bright red sphere. Time seemed to slow as he reached the pond's edge, his foot slipping on the wet grass. He stumbled, his arms flailing, and then with a splash he fell into the water. For a moment, everything was still. The boy's parents turned, their faces shifting from relaxed to horrified in an instant. They jumped up, running towards the pond, their shouts piercing the air. People around the park stopped and stared, their faces etched with shock and concern. Claudia didn't hesitate. She dropped her book and sprinted towards the water, her heart pounding. The boy's small form bobbed on the surface, his arms thrashing as he struggled to keep his head above water. His terrified cries cut through the noise, sending a chill down her spine. "Hold on," she shouted, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. She reached the pond, and without a second thought dove in. The water was cold, but she barely felt it. Her focus was entirely on the boy, his panicked eyes meeting hers as she swam towards him. Reaching him, she grabbed his arms, speaking softly to calm him. "It's okay, I've got you," she said, pulling him close. He clung to her, his small hands gripping her shirt, his body trembling with fear. Claudia kicked her legs, keeping them both afloat as she slowly made her way back to the shore. The boy's parents were at the water's edge, their faces pale and anxious. As soon as Claudia was close enough, they reached out, pulling their son into their arms. He burst into tears, burying his face in his mother's shoulder. She hugged him tightly, her own eyes filled with tears of relief. "Oh my God, thank you." The mother cried, looking at Claudia with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "You saved him." Claudia, still catching her breath, managed a small smile. "I'm just glad he's okay," she said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. The father, his hands shaking, looked at her with disbelief. "Where did you learn to do that?" "You are amazing." Claudia shrugged lightly, wiping water from her face. "I help out at home a lot," she said simply. "You just learn things." The parents exchanged a bewildered glance. They wanted to ask more, but in that moment, all they could do was hold their son, still shaken by how close they had come to losing him. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, murmuring with admiration for the young girl who had jumped into the pond without a second thought. One of the bystanders, an older woman who had seen the whole thing, stepped forward, her eyes warm with approval. "You were so brave, dear," she said, patting Claudia's shoulder. "Not many people would have reacted so quickly." Claudia blushed, feeling suddenly self-conscious under all the attention. "It was nothing," she mumbled. "I just did what anyone would do." But the looks on the faces around her told her that what she had done was far from ordinary. The parents, still holding their son, seemed unable to stop thanking her. They insisted she sit with them, offering her water and a blanket from their picnic basket to help her dry off. As they sat together on the bench, the parents asked Claudia about herself, her family, her interests. She answered politely but vaguely, not wanting to draw too much attention to her personal life. She told them she liked to read, that she often came to the park because it was a quiet place to think. She mentioned her mother, who was unwell, and how she spent most of her time taking care of her. The parents exchanged concerned glances but didn't press her for details. There was something about the girl that intrigued them, something beyond her bravery and quick thinking. Her calmness, her humility, the way she seemed so much older than her years. It all made them wonder about her story, about who she really was. As the conversation continued, Claudia found herself relaxing. The parents were kind, genuinely interested in her, and she enjoyed talking to them. But as much as she liked them, she knew she couldn't stay long. She had responsibilities at home, and she didn't want them to pry too deeply into her life. Eventually she stood up, thanking them for the blanket and the water. The parents tried to offer her money as a token of their gratitude, but she refused, smiling politely. "It's really okay," she said. "I'm just glad I could help." As she turned to leave, her father called out, his voice tinged with curiosity and something like worry. "Will we see you again?" Claudia paused, looking back at them with a small, thoughtful smile. "Maybe," she said softly. "Take care of him." And with that, she walked away, leaving the family watching her retreating figure with a mix of admiration and bewilderment. They knew they had just met someone truly special, but they had no idea how special she really was, or the incredible story that lay behind her quiet courage. The next day, the wealthy family couldn't get Claudia out of their minds. The father, Mr. Benson, a successful businessman, found himself distracted at work, replaying the events from the park. His wife, Mrs. Benson, spent the day talking to their son, James, about what had happened. He was still shaken, but he spoke of Claudia with admiration, saying how she made him feel safe even when he was so scared. The more they thought about it, the more they felt a need to know more about the girl who had so bravely saved their son. That evening, the Bensons decided to return to the park, hoping to see Claudia again. They arrived just as the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the playground and picnic areas. Children were still playing and families were scattered across the grassy fields, but there was no sign of the girl who had captured their hearts. They waited for a while, sitting on the same bench where they had first met her. As time passed, they began to worry that she might not come back. They talked quietly, speculating about who she might be, where she lived, and why she seemed so modest despite her incredible bravery. "Do you think she's okay?" Mrs. Benson asked, her voice filled with concern. She mentioned her mother being unwell. What if she's taking care of her all by herself? Mr. Benson nodded thoughtfully. "It's possible. She seemed very mature for her age, didn't she? Like she's had to grow up faster than most kids." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an elderly woman who often walked her small dog in the park. She paused as she passed by their bench, giving them a friendly smile. "Good evening," she said. "Are you looking for someone?" "Yes, actually," Mrs. Benson replied, her face lighting up with hope. "There was a young girl here yesterday, Claudia. She helped our son when he had an accident. We were hoping to see her again." The elderly woman's eyes softened with recognition. "Ah, Claudia, such a sweet child. Always looking out for others." "Do you know her?" Mr. Benson asked eagerly. "We'd love to know more about her." The woman nodded, sitting down beside them. "I've seen her here many times. She comes almost every day, always alone, always with a book. She's very quiet, but very kind. She helps the younger kids when they fall or need someone to play with, but she never stays long." Mrs. Benson leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "Do you know anything about her family?" The woman sighed softly. "I know a little. She lives nearby with her mother, who's been very ill for some time. I've heard that Claudia takes care of her. It's just the two of them. Her mother was once a teacher, a wonderful woman, But then she got sick, and everything changed. The Bensons exchanged a troubled glance. That's so much responsibility for a young girl, Mrs. Benson murmured, her heart aching at the thought of Claudia bearing such a heavy burden alone. Yes, it is, the woman agreed, but Claudia never complains. She's always so cheerful and strong. A lot of us here worry about her, though. She's a child, but she's had to grow up too fast. Mr. Benson frowned, his mind racing. Does anyone help her? Family, friends? The woman shook her head. Not that I know of. Her mother doesn't have any family nearby, and I think they've lost touch with old friends. Claudia handles everything on her own. The Bensons were silent for a moment, absorbing this information. It was hard to imagine a child so young managing so much. The thought of her coming to the park every day, perhaps for a brief respite from her responsibilities, filled them with a deep sense of sadness and admiration. We'd like to help, Mrs. Benson said finally, but we don't know how to reach her. The woman smiled gently. She'll be back. This park is like a second home to her. Just keep coming, and you'll find her again. With that, the woman stood, giving them a reassuring nod before continuing on her way. The Bensons watched her leave, their thoughts heavy. We have to do something, Mrs. Benson said quietly. We can't just leave her to handle everything by herself. Mr. Benson nodded in agreement. We will. We'll find a way to help. But first, we need to talk to her to understand what she needs. For the next few days, the Bensons returned to the park every evening, hoping to see Claudia. They watched as children played, their laughter ringing through the air, but Claudia was nowhere to be found. Each day, they left the park feeling a little more anxious, a little more determined. Finally, on the 5th day, they spotted her. She was sitting on her usual bench, her head bent over a book, her long braids falling forward as she read. Their hearts lifted at the sight of her, and they approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. Claudia, Mrs. Benson called softly. Claudia looked up, surprise flashing in her eyes. She seemed almost shy as she smiled at them. Overload, she said, closing her book. I didn't expect to see you again. We were hoping to see you, Mr. Benson said warmly. We've been coming back, hoping we could talk to you. Claudia's expression turned curious. Talk to me? About what? Mrs. Benson sat down beside her, her eyes gentle. About you. You were so brave, helping James the way you did. We wanted to know more about you, about your family. Claudia hesitated, her eyes flicking between them. She seemed unsure, her natural caution kicking in. There's not much to tell, she said finally. It's just me and my mom. Mr. Benson's voice was kind but firm. We heard about your mother. We're so sorry to hear that she's been ill. Claudia's face tightened, her gaze dropping to her lap. It's okay. We're managing. Mrs. Benson reached out, her hand resting gently on Claudia's. Claudia, we want to help. Please, let us help you and your mom. Claudia looked up, her eyes wide and wary. Help us? Why? Because you've been so strong doing everything on your own, Mr. Benson said. But you shouldn't have to. We want to support you, however we can. Tears welled up in Claudia's eyes, but she blinked them back quickly, shaking her head. You don't have to do that. We're fine. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Mrs. Benson said softly, her heart aching for this brave, sweet girl. You're a hero, Claudia. And sometimes even heroes need help. For a long moment, Claudia was silent, her small face set in a mixture of hope and fear. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Maybe we could use a little help. The Bensons smiled, their hearts lifting with relief and hope. They knew this was just the beginning, but it was a start. They would find a way to support Claudia and her mother, to make sure they weren't alone in their struggles. As they sat there, talking quietly about the things Claudia liked, her love of books, her favorite stories, her dreams for the future, the Bensons felt something shift within them. It was more than just gratitude or admiration. It was a deep, abiding connection, a sense of responsibility and care that went beyond what they had expected. They had found Claudia, and now they knew they would do everything in their power to ensure that she and her mother had the support they needed. Because no one, especially not someone as brave and kind as Claudia, should have to face the world alone. The Bensons couldn't stop thinking about Claudia. After their brief conversation with her in the park, they were more determined than ever to learn more about her situation and find ways to help. They had promised to meet her again, but they wanted to be better prepared. Mrs. Benson especially felt a strong connection to Claudia, who reminded her of herself as a child. Independent, strong-willed, and a bit too grown-up for her age. After much discussion, Mr. Benson decided to do some research. He felt that, to help Claudia properly, they needed to know more about her and her family's circumstances. Using the few details Claudia had shared, he reached out to some local contacts in the community. What he discovered was more than they had ever expected. One evening, after putting their son James to bed, Mr. Benson sat down with his wife, his expression serious. "I found out some things about Claudia and her mother," he began, his voice low. "And I think you should know." Mrs. Benson looked up from her book, concern knitting her brow. "What is it? Is everything okay?" Mr. Benson nodded slowly. "I managed to speak with a few people who know them. Claudia's mother was, at one time, a very prominent community leader. She was known for her work in education and advocacy, especially for underprivileged children and families. But then she got sick, and things started to fall apart." Mrs. Benson's eyes widened. "I had no idea. What happened?" "She was diagnosed with a chronic illness that forced her to step down from her work. Without her income, they lost their home and had to move into a shelter. Claudia has been taking care of her mother ever since. They've been struggling, but from what I've heard, Claudia's mother is still highly respected. People speak of her like she's some kind of local hero." Mrs. Benson felt a lump form in her throat. But why didn't anyone step in to help them? Mr. Benson sighed. "Pride, probably. Claudia's mother is proud and private. And Claudia, well, she's taken on that burden herself. She's been doing everything she can to keep their lives together, but they're barely getting by." Mrs. Benson felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. That poor girl, she's been carrying so much, all by herself. "There's more," Mr. Benson said gently, pulling out a small folder. "I found out that Claudia was once part of a prestigious academic program. She's incredibly bright, one of the top students in the district. But she had to leave the program to care for her mother. They tried to get her to stay, even offered a scholarship, but she refused." Mrs. Benson was stunned. She's only 12. She shouldn't have to make choices like that. "I know," Mr. Benson said quietly. "It's heartbreaking. But she did it without a second thought. She wanted to be there for her mother." Mrs. Benson looked at the information in the folder, feeling a surge of admiration mixed with sadness. Claudia's life had been full of promise, but circumstances had forced her to grow up too fast, to take on responsibilities no child should have to bear. "We have to do something," Mrs. Benson said firmly. "We have to help her and her mother." "I agree," Mr. Benson said, reaching out to take her hand. "But we have to be careful. We don't want to overwhelm them or make them feel like a charity case. We need to find a way to support them that respects their dignity and their wishes." Mrs. Benson nodded, her mind racing. "Maybe we can start small. Offer to help with medical expenses for her mother. Or see if we can get Claudia back into that academic program. She deserves every opportunity." Mr. Benson squeezed her hand. "That's a good idea. We can talk to her and see what she needs. And we should reach out to the school, see if they'd be willing to reinstate her scholarship." The next day, they met Claudia again at the park. She was sitting on her usual bench, a new book in her hands. When she saw them approaching, she smiled shyly, clearly surprised that they had come back. "Hello, Claudia," Mrs. Benson greeted warmly, sitting down beside her. "We've been thinking about you and your mom. We wanted to know if there's anything we can do to help." Claudia's smile faltered, and she looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of her book. You don't have to do anything. We're fine. Mrs. Benson exchanged a glance with her husband before gently placing a hand on Claudia's shoulder. We know you're doing your best, and it's more than anyone could ask, but sometimes it's okay to accept help. We heard about your mother and everything you've been doing for her. You're incredibly brave. Claudia blinked, her eyes wide and startled. How? How did you know? We just asked around, Mr. Benson said softly. We wanted to understand more about you, because you've already done so much for our family. We'd like to give something back. Maybe help with your mom's medical bills, or talk to your school about getting you back into that academic program you were in. Claudia's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, shaking her head. I don't want to be a burden. We're used to taking care of things ourselves. You're not a burden, Mrs. Benson said firmly. You're an inspiration, and we want to help because we care about you. We see how hard you're working, and we just want to make things a little easier for you and your mom. Claudia looked at them, her expression a mixture of disbelief and hope. For a long moment she said nothing, her small face tight with emotion. Then slowly she nodded. Okay, she whispered. Maybe we could use some help. The Bensons smiled, their hearts lifting with relief. They knew this was just the beginning of a long journey, but they were committed to being there for Claudia and her mother. As they sat together, talking quietly about the future, they felt a deep sense of connection and purpose. They had come to the park seeking answers, and they had found so much more. A courageous young girl who had inspired them to be better, to give more, and to open their hearts in ways they had never imagined. And as they looked at Claudia, her eyes shining with new hope, they knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. As the weeks passed, the Bensons kept their promise to help Claudia and her mother in any way they could. At first, Claudia was hesitant to accept their assistance. She was used to doing everything on her own and was wary of relying on others. But slowly, with gentle encouragement, she began to let them into her life. The Bensons arranged for a specialist to visit Claudia's mother, Mrs. Martin, at their small apartment. The doctor was kind and respectful, treating Mrs. Martin with dignity and providing her with much-needed medical care. He recommended a new treatment plan, and with the Bensons' financial support, Mrs. Martin started to show signs of improvement. One day, after a particularly encouraging visit from the doctor, Mrs. Benson suggested something that made Claudia's eyes light up with excitement and anxiety. Claudia, would you like to visit your old school, just to see it again? Claudia hesitated. But I'm not a student there anymore. They wouldn't want me back. Mrs. Benson smiled gently. I think they would, and if it's something you'd like, we'd be happy to help you re-enroll. Claudia's heart raced. She had loved that school, the vibrant classrooms, and the teachers who had encouraged her to dream big. Leaving had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done, but she had accepted it as necessary. The thought of going back, of being a part of that world again, filled her with both hope and fear. What if I can't keep up? She whispered, looking down at her hands. What if I'm not good enough anymore? Mr. Benson, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. You're more than good enough, Claudia. You've shown strength and resilience beyond your years. If anyone can succeed, it's you. Encouraged by their words, Claudia agreed to visit the school. The next day, the Bensons drove her to the campus. As they walked through the gates, Claudia felt a rush of memories. She saw familiar faces, teachers who had once taught her, and friends who looked surprised but happy to see her. Her former principal, a kind woman with a warm smile, came over to greet them. Claudia, it's wonderful to see you again. We've missed you here. Claudia's cheeks flushed with a mix of shyness and happiness. I've missed being here too, she said quietly. The principal glanced at the Bensons, who nodded encouragingly. We'd love to have you back, Claudia, the principal continued. Your teachers have always spoken so highly of you. We even kept your spot in the advanced program open, just in case. Claudia's eyes widened. Really? Yes, the principal said warmly. We know you had to leave because of your family situation, but if you're ready and willing, we'd be honored to have you rejoin us. Claudia turned to Mrs. Benson, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Do you really think I can do this? Mrs. Benson knelt down so she was at eye level with Claudia. I know you can. You're one of the strongest, most capable people I've ever met, and we'll be here to support you every step of the way. Taking a deep breath, Claudia nodded. Okay, I want to try. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Claudia was re-enrolled in her old school, and the Bensons helped her catch up on the work she had missed. They provided her with school supplies and even arranged for a tutor to help her get back on track. Claudia threw herself into her studies with a passion, determined to make the most of this opportunity. Meanwhile, the Bensons continued to support Mrs. Martin's recovery. As her health improved, Mrs. Martin expressed her gratitude to the Bensons. I don't know what we would have done without you, she told them one afternoon. You've given us hope again. Mr. Benson smiled. It's been our pleasure, really. Claudia is an extraordinary girl, and she deserves every chance to succeed. We're just glad we could help. With the Bensons' support, Claudia flourished at school. She quickly caught up with her peers and soon surpassed even her own expectations. Their teachers praised her for her intelligence and determination, and she made new friends who admired her resilience and kindness. But it wasn't just academics where Claudia shone. She also found time to volunteer, helping other students who were struggling and organizing events to support families in need. Her own experiences had given her a deep empathy for others, and she wanted to give back to the community that had helped her. One day, as the school year was drawing to a close, the principal called Claudia to her office. Mrs. Benson, who had been volunteering at the school, was there too. Claudia's heart raced as she walked in, wondering what this was about. Claudia, the principal said, her eyes shining with pride, we're thrilled to tell you that you've been chosen for a special scholarship. It's a full scholarship to one of the best private schools in the city, covering all your tuition and expenses. Claudia gasped. A scholarship? For me? Yes, for you, the principal said with a smile. It's in recognition of your academic achievements and your incredible contributions to our school community. You've inspired so many people here, Claudia. This is our way of saying thank you. Claudia felt tears welling up in her eyes. She turned to Mrs. Benson, who was smiling through her own tears. I don't know what to say, Claudia whispered. It's everything I ever dreamed of. Mrs. Benson hugged her tightly. You've earned it, Claudia. You've worked so hard, and now you're getting the chance you deserve. As they left the office, Claudia felt like she was floating. She had gone from feeling alone and overwhelmed to having a support system that believed in her. The Bensons had become like family, helping her and her mother in ways she could never have imagined. And now she had the chance to pursue her dreams, to build a future that was bright and full of promise. That evening, as they sat together around the dinner table, Claudia, her mother, and the Bensons, they celebrated the incredible journey they had all been on. It had been a long, challenging road, but they had come through it together, stronger and more united than ever. As Claudia looked around at the smiling faces, she knew that this was just the beginning. With the love and support of her newfound family, she felt ready to take on whatever challenges the future might hold. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly, deeply happy. Thanks for subscribing. Kindly subscribe to our channel and share to your community. See you next time.